The story of Frank Stronach was once the North American success story. It began in 1954, when an Austrian immigrant stepped off a boat in Montreal with nothing but a few dollars and a burning ambition. A tool and die maker by trade, he understood the language of machinery and the rhythm of hard labor. In a small rented garage in Toronto, he started what would eventually become Magna International. Through decades of sheer grit and strategic brilliance, he transformed that humble workshop into a global powerhouse, a titan of the automotive parts industry that employed thousands of people across the planet. To the public, the Frank Stronach was the living embodiment of the American dream. He was a man who had conquered the world of commerce through a philosophy he called fair enterprise, a system designed to share profits with employees and reinvest in the community. As his wealth swelled into the billions, Stronach's influence expanded far beyond the factory floor. He became a legendary figure in horse racing, owning sprawling estates and prestigious tracks in North America. His face was a staple at high society events, and his voice carried weight in the halls of political power. He was seen as a generous philanthropist, a visionary who believed in the moral responsibility of the elite. For decades, his reputation remained untarnished, a polished finish on a legacy that seemed destined for the history books as a triumph of character and capitalism. And he was the grandfather of Canadian industry, a man whose name was synonymous with success, integrity, and the rewards of a life well lived. However, in the early summer of 2024, the foundation of this empire began to tremble. In June, the news broke like a thunderclap across the nation. Frank Stronach, the 91-year-old billionaire, had been arrested and charged with multiple counts of sexual assault. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The announcement sent shockwaves through boardrooms from Toronto to Vienna, leaving the public in disbelief. This was not a minor legal dispute or a corporate oversight. These were criminal allegations suggesting a dark duality to a man the world thought it knew. The details that emerged from the police reports were chilling, in stark contrast to Stronach's carefully curated public image. The charges included not only sexual assault, but also forcible, confinement, and indecent assault. Perhaps most shocking was the temporal scope of the alleged crimes. The incidents brought forward by the complainants did not describe a single moment of lapse in judgment, but rather a timeline that spanned nearly half a century, stretching from the early 1980s all the way to 2023. This revelation suggested that while Stronach was building his business empire, a shadow was trailing him through the decades. It raised uncomfortable questions about the dynamics of power and the silence that wealth can often purchase in the shadows of the elite. The accusers were stepping forward against a man with unlimited resources, a man who could hire the finest legal minds on the continent. The psychological weight of such a decision is heavy. To challenge a billionaire is to walk into a storm where the wind is always blowing against you. Stronach's response was immediate and resolute. Through his high-profile legal team, he maintained a stance of innocence, denying every allegation leveled against him. He appeared in the public eye not as a man defeated by age, but as a fierce fighter ready to defend his honor. Yet, as the days passed, the narrative began to shift. What started as a few voices soon grew into a chorus, as more women came forward with similar accounts of trauma and misconduct. The sheer number of complainants began to transform the case from a series of incidents into a potential pattern of behavior spanning several generations. The world watched with bated breath as the mask of the great philanthropist began to slip. As the investigation deepened, the question was no longer just about the specific legal charges, but about the core of the man himself. Who was the real Frank Stronach? And what secrets were hidden behind the doors of his multi-billion-dollar kingdom? The legal landscape surrounding Frank Stronach shifted from a localized tremor to a full-scale earthquake. What had initially been a handful of accusations ballooned into a staggering list of criminal charges. The police revealed the number of complainants had reached double digits. Each new voice added a layer of complexity, painting a portrait of a man whose private conduct was the opposite of his public persona. It was becoming a narrative of a systematic, decades-long pattern of behavior occurring behind the closed doors of corporate offices and private estates. For the women involved, the choice to step forward was fraught with emotional peril. Many were speaking about events that had remained buried for 40 years, traumas pushed into the recesses of their minds as they moved on. Coming forward meant reliving moments of vulnerability and fear, confronting the most powerful man in Canada today. The courage required to testify against a figure with the resources to hire an army of legal specialists cannot be overstated. These women were seeking a long-delayed acknowledgement of their reality, challenging the silence that had protected Stronach for half a century. Stronach's defense team wasted no time in articulating their counteroffensive. Each in their strategy was rooted in the inherent difficulty of prosecuting historical allegations. They leaned heavily on the fallibility of human memory, questioning how any witness could provide reliable testimony about events from the 1980s. The defense sought to frame the accusations as inconsistent, aiming to create reasonable doubt by highlighting the lack of physical evidence from such distant eras. To them, the case was an attempt to dismantle a legendary life based on whispers from the distant past. While the legal battle raged, an internal war was being fought within the Stronach dynasty. The billionaire's family, once a united front representing the pinnacle of success, found itself fractured. The name Magna International, which Stronach had spent decades forging into a symbol of excellence, now faced a crisis of identity. Whereas the corporate giant scrambled to distance its operations from its founder's personal legal troubles, but the stain was difficult to wash away. The legacy Stronach had hoped to leave for his children was being poisoned, replaced by headlines that prioritized his alleged crimes over his industrial achievements. The public discourse soon evolved into a broader debate about billionaire privilege. People questioned whether the justice system was truly equipped to hold someone of Stronach's immense wealth accountable. The optics of a man with unlimited capital fighting a legal war against women with fewer resources became a focal point of frustration. This case was seen as a litmus test, a question of whether the momentum of accountability could penetrate the highest echelons of the global elite. Inside the courtroom during the pre-trial hearings, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Frank Stronach, though showing the signs of his 91 years, remained a presence of cold, unwavering defiance. He sat flanked by his advisors, a stark contrast to the complainants who occupied the same space, their faces etched with the weight of their decision. The air was heavy with the palpable shift in public opinion. The reverence that once followed him had been replaced by a skeptical, almost somber curiosity. The world was no longer looking at a hero, but at a man being forced to answer for a lifetime of hidden choices. Just as the defense seemed to gain traction with their arguments about the unreliability of old memories, a shocking development rippled through the legal community. A specific piece of digital evidence emerged, and a set of corroborating documents from an unexpected corporate source that threatened to bridge the gap between the past and the present. This new revelation suggested that the defense's focus on the passage of time might not be enough to shield Stronach from the mounting evidence. The walls were finally closing in, and the very foundation of his innocence began to crumble as a critical witness prepared to deliver a blow that could shatter the billionaire's carefully constructed wall of silence. The air in the courtroom grew heavy as the trial reached its zenith. The prosecution presented the surfaced digital records, aligning them with the testimonies of women who had carried their burdens in silence for years. During cross-examination, the defense team focused and poked at every possible inconsistency. They were surgical in attempting to frame the accusations as a collection of unreliable memories. However, the prosecution remained steadfast, weaving a narrative of a calculated, persistent abuse of power that relied on the very stature Stronach had spent his life building. Then came the emotional peak, the moral confrontation. One by one, the complainants took the stand, their voices trembling yet resolute. For the first time in decades, the power dynamic was inverted. Stronach, once a commander of global boardrooms, was forced to sit in silence as his accusers spoke their truths directly to him. They did not just ask for a verdict. They demanded an acknowledgement of the pain they endured. The courtroom watched as the aging billionaire, now stripped of his corporate armor, avoided their gaze, his face a mask of weary defiance. The psychological weight in the room was suffocating as the facade of the untouchable visionary finally began to crack under the pressure of human vulnerability. In their closing arguments, the prosecution made a final, impassioned plea for justice. They argued that if the law couldn't reach a man simply because he was wealthy and old, then the law itself was a hollow promise. They emphasized that the pattern of behavior was the evidence, a consistent thread of misconduct that defied the odds of coincidence. Conversely, the defense hammered home the principle of the presumption of innocence. They argued that without physical evidence or contemporaneous reports, the court was being asked to destroy a man's legacy based on stories from a different era. They painted Stronach as a victim of a changing cultural landscape. He's an old man being tried by the standards of today for the alleged ghosts of yesterday. As the proceedings dragged on, the personal toll on Frank Stronach became impossible to ignore. The vigor he had displayed at the start of the legal battle had evaporated, replaced by a visible fragility. He was no longer the titan of Magna International. He was a 92-year-old man facing the very real possibility of spending his final years within the confines of a prison cell, or under the scrutiny of a permanent legal shadow. The billionaire's privilege, which had once felt like an impenetrable fortress, was now a crumbling ruin. His family, once the beneficiaries of his vast success, stood by as spectators to the slow-motion collapse of their name. As the internal strife and public shame had turned his golden years into a landscape of regret and litigation. Beyond the walls of the court, the trial resonated as a landmark moment in Canadian history. It signaled a shift in the Me Too era, proving that the country's corporate elite were no longer beyond the reach of accountability. It dismantled the myth that a lifetime of philanthropy could buy immunity for private transgressions. Regardless of the technical legal outcome, the stain on Stronach's legacy was permanent. The fair enterprise he had championed was now forever linked to the unfair treatment of the vulnerable. The empire he built was in metaphorical ruins, its foundation revealed to be as flawed as the man who designed it. In the end, as the final gavel prepared to fall, the resolution was found not just in a judgment, but in the truth. For the victims, the act of speaking out had brought a sense of peace that no financial settlement or legal victory could provide. They had reclaimed their narratives from the man who had tried to bury them. The story of Frank Stronach concluded not with the triumph of an immigrant's dream, but with a somber reflection on the corruptive nature of unchecked power and the inevitable march of time that eventually brings secrets into the unforgiving, clear morning light.